China has long been the major growth story, but could Africa be stealing its crown? I'm joined by emerging markets economist Charles Robertson to discuss. Well, Charles, in 2013, you did a TED Talk which said Africa is about to boom. So almost 3 years on, have your predictions been justified?
So far, they're all on track. After 10, 15 years of very, very strong growth, what we saw in India in the 90s, what we saw in developing Asia in the 80s, it looks like is unfolding in sub-Saharan Africa as well today. And that is a growth consolidation phase. So you've had an acceleration for 15 years. For 5 years, it slows, and it slowed in both these other episodes as well. And I think that's because they've run out of everything. They've run out of infrastructure. They've run out of electricity. The ports are full. The roads are full. And so what governments now have to deliver is the infrastructure to enable a re-acceleration of growth in the 2020s. Providing that comes through and continues to happen, then I think you get even faster growth in the 2020s, well above what you'll see in China.
What would you say is behind Africa's emergence?
I talk a lot about demographics, but recently I've been saying demographics have always been good. They were good in the 70s or 80s as well. Didn't stop Sub-Sahara having terrible problems in the 80s. What I think is the biggest, most important change is education. It's the figure showing 7% of Nigerians were at secondary school in 1977. 93% of Nigerians aged 12 were not at secondary school at the end of the 1970s. So who was going to put money into Nigeria in the 1980s when the oil price plunged? Nobody. Today, almost everybody in Sub-Sahara, at least 900 million of the billion people, live in countries where at least 30% of kids are at secondary school. So there is sufficient human capital to enable an economy to grow well, even if commodity prices are lower.
And how is Africa's new prosperity impacting the rest of the world?
I think Africa's got on people's radar screens. I see that among financial market participants, and people I would never have expected to even notice the continent are now buying assets. If Bob Diamond steps down from Barclays or leaves Barclays and goes and sets up a fund specifically to invest in Africa, that wouldn't have happened 15 years ago.
Charles, surely the boom was inevitable, as after all, Africa holds a huge amount of natural resources and potential, but there is a glass ceiling in the form of corruption, surely.
It hasn't stopped other countries doing better. China, East Asia, at similar income levels to where Sub-Sahara is, also had huge corruption issues. And what I see in China today is China getting to that income level, about $5,000 to $10,000, where the middle class is no longer prepared to tolerate the unbridled corruption that has existed before. So I think the anti-corruption campaign you see in China today is a function of a rising middle class.
What does China mean for Africa? And surely this might mean future interference.
A lot of people talk about Chinese investment in Africa. It tends not to be direct investment. It tends to be loans. But the loans have been geared, to take Angola as an example. China takes millions of barrels of oil from Angola, lends them money, knowing that the Angolans have the revenue stream to repay that money. So the Chinese are doing quite well. They're getting oil and they're then selling back services, construction services, telecom services. But the Angolans are also doing okay because they're both selling oil, they would have done that anyway, but they're also getting infrastructure built. Perhaps 30 years ago, the oil receipts would have ended up in a Swiss bank account and not in the form of a road or a 4G network.
So what are the things to watch in Africa in the coming years? I'm thinking about up-and-coming countries.
The really interesting development story at the moment is probably East Africa. You've got this very, very strong growth out of Ethiopia for 15 years. The biggest reformers on the Ease of Doing Business survey from the World Bank this year was a 5-point improvement, a 21-place rank improvement by countries like Kenya. And Uganda also had similar improvement. So it looks like East Africa is saying, we want to make ourselves as attractive as possible. We want to be the next countries to industrialise. Vietnam's doing it now. Pakistan and Bangladesh, Sri Lanka are kind of hoping to be next, or slightly next already. Kenya, Uganda are gearing themselves up to be, and Ethiopia to be the ones afterwards.
And overall, what do you think the future global economic landscape will look like over the coming years?
I would guess growth is going to be 4 to 5% in Sub-Sahara for the next 5 years. India should do better, more like 7, 8%. As we go into the 2020s, that's when I would expect, assuming infrastructure, electricity, roads, ports and so on is delivered, that's when Sub-Sahara starts to give us the 7 to 8% growth that becomes world-beating.